All right. Those of you that followed old school wrestling, which we considered to be before 1985, it's not like the entertainment value that's out there today with the WWE and some of the smaller groups. It's a completely different product. If you followed it before 1985, and if you were lucky enough to live in around Minnesota or AWA cities, you saw all these great names, the Crusher and the Bruiser and the Alaskan and Larry Hennig and Dr. X and Cowboy Bill Watts and Pepper Gomez and Crusher Blackwell and the Sheik, Adnan Al Casey and all Mad Dog Vachon, all these guys that were household names. The one thing that made them interesting was they all had to come up with a gimmick. That was important in wrestling. Each wrestler had to find an identity. If you were just bland and boring and came to the ring, and the best example of that, some of you may have heard, I told you this once, there was a guy back in the late 40s, early 40s, by the name of George Wagner. And George Wagner had been wrestling for about 4 or 5 years. And George Wagner was about as bland as potatoes without gravy on them, okay? He'd come to the ring, get in the ring, do his thing, get beat usually, go home. Now remember, it was predetermined that he was going to lose. Let's just get that on the table right away. But here was the deal with George Wagner. He wasn't exciting. And so on his own, he came up with this great idea. What if I did something different to be noticed? Now you got to remember, this is back in the early 40s, just a little bit before World War II. So you got this shorter guy, Gorgeous George was about 5'9", 5'8", if he was that. And brown hair, just plain. Well, he came up with an idea. I'm going to grow my hair long. I'm going to go and get a permanent in it. Now, we're talking a guy here, okay? Grow it long, get a permanent, and bleach it blonde. And then, well, I just can't go in with just, my shirt, or no shirt, trunks. I got to go in, and I got to have a robe. So he's got these fancy robes that are made. And that was the invention of Gorgeous George. Anybody of you have heard of Gorgeous George? And he'd come into the ring, and he'd have his robes on, and they were flowing, and he'd strut. Oh man, just irritate the fans. And he had gold bobby pins. He called them Georgie pins. And he'd throw them to the ladies at ringside. And then he'd insult the guys. He'd look at the guy on the front row sitting next to his wife. He'd say, "Hey honey, you're sitting with that big fat beer drinking husband you dragged off the couch. Why don't you look at a real man?" Well, that gets attention. He's booed, he's hated. Okay, so Gorgeous George became what they call box office. Everybody wanted him on their cards. And he'd come into the ring and the referee would want to check him before the matches. And he'd say, "Don't touch me with your dirty hands." He's just an arrogant. And he played a very, for the time period, he really had a feminine character that he played. He also would come into town. And when he came into town, he would go to the newspaper and take out an ad that Gorgeous George is here. And he'd have the newspaper follow him to get a permanent in town. And he'd go down the main street. He promoted himself. He became, literally, after World War II, became the top drawing wrestler. Everybody wanted him. Now, in that era, wrestling was divided into these territories. You got to remember, we didn't have internet. We didn't have Google. All we had was our morning paper, a little radio station, and you had your TV station after World War II when TV started coming in, and you probably had 3, maybe 4 channels. Well, one of the channels on TV came out of Chicago. It was the Dumont Network, and it was a national hookup. And they decided they could do something really well and pick up professional wrestling because it was cheap to put on. So they would get a hold of these top wrestlers from around the country. Gorgeous George was number 1 on the list because if they had George on their card, they made money. And then they had, after World War II, there was a guy named Vern Gagne. You guys have heard of Vern Gagne, right? Vern Gagne, he was a real deal. He comes out of the University of Minnesota, graduated, played football, got drafted by the Chicago Bears, turned down a football contract because back in those days, they didn't have, anything near the crazy salaries we have today in sports. He was gonna be paid $6,000. Now again, this is back in 1948, 49. I suppose that was good money back then, but still not good money. And he decided that because he was an Olympic wrestler, he represented the United States in the 1948 Olympics. He wrestled as a clean-cut, I always call it mom's apple pie good guy. He couldn't do any wrong, and no matter what, he was the favorite. And he could really wrestle. He emphasized amateur wrestling, bringing it into professional wrestling. So he had a great gimmick in that respect. He became wanted all over the country. That was a gimmick. Anytime the Dumont Network wanted a top wrestler, let's get Gorgeous George. Let's get Vern Gagne. There were a couple of others that just put TV on fire. A guy by the name of, I always have trouble pronouncing his name, but it's Wladek Kowalski. You can pronounce that, right?
Sure can.
Okay. Wladek Kowalski. And he ended up going by Walter because I think it was simpler for the fans. But Killer Kowalski is what he became. And this was totally by accident, kids. He's in the ring. He's wrestling as Tarzan Kowalski. Sometimes a good guy. He had the singlet on and he'd come in the ring, kind of a good guy. Tarzan Kowalski. And he's in the ring with a guy named Yukon Eric out of Alaska. And Yukon was kind of a mountain type guy, strong, used bear hugs, and he was a fan favorite. Well, he gets in the ring with Killer Kowalski one night, and an accident happened. Kowalski got up on the top rope, and he came down, and he was going to jump on the prone position of Yukon laying in the ring. And of course, this was normal for their routine that they had done in other matches. But this particular night, Eric moved just a little bit, and Kowalski came down on the side of his head and literally, I swear to you, and I do have pictures of this, and this is in the newspaper, took his ear off. Oh. And his ear, true story, was laying in the ring. And the referee, being alert, picked it up. While the fans started booing Kowalski as Eric is bleeding and squinching in pain. They played it up so well that when Eric was in the hospital, Killer goes on TV, or he went on TV, and he's now Killer Kowalski because he tried to kill him. And he actually boasted. He said, "I wish I would have killed him." Well, that's not really good. So eventually, Killer Kowalski, and they carried that storyline, that feud between them, for over a decade. Everywhere they went, it was a main event because people wanted to see Eric get revenge. And Killer Kowalski got this new gimmick of being this just horrible wrestler. So there's a gimmick. Now the thing that was important about these gimmicks is that, you guys have heard me say before, it wasn't important just to be a wrestler. Sometimes you had to be an evil German. And you remember after World War II, we were at war with Germany and Japan, and we had to have the evil Japanese. I've told you before, they weren't politically correct. Programs read, dirty Japs on card tonight, okay? And it was politically correct for the era, but they got booed. And then you had to have Russians that were bad, evil Russians. And I do always remind you that Russia was an ally to the United States in the war in '42, but they were still the evil garlic-eating Russians, okay? So those ethnic villains made up. The interesting thing is that most of them who played these wrestlers, they weren't really a German, or they weren't really a Russian, or they weren't really Japanese. Most of the Japanese at the time were Hawaiian-born individuals, okay, and took on strange names like Mitsu Arakawa and Kinji Shibuya, and they used the karate chops and threw salt in the eyes, and they're gonna take over America again. And a lot of the Russians, just normal guys from the United States, a guy named Ed Bruce decides, I'm going to be a Russian and become Ivan Kilmakov. Okay, it worked. A Frenchman out of Canada, Guy LaRose, wrestled like Gorgeous George did for a few years, not making much money and just kind of mediocre. decided to shave his head bald and goose-stepped across the ring and became the German Hans Schmidt. Okay? Money like you wouldn't believe, because they hated him. So there's where the gimmicks come in. And then you had your colorful characters along with Gorgeous George. You had guys like Buddy Rogers, Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers. And Buddy, all he had to do was just say, you know, it couldn't happen to a better guy, and he'd swip back his blonde hair, and then he'd strut in the ring, you know, and they'd boo him, and made lots of money. But one of the gimmicks that I found always intriguing, and you see I got a picture up there, and you guys, I know you all remember this, the Lone Ranger, okay? When I was, 10, 11, 12 years old, Clayton Moore comes on, that's the Lone Ranger on TV. And we all know that, you know, those thrilling days of yesteryear with his faithful Indian companion Tonto, the daring and resourceful masked rider of the plains, fights the law and order of the early West, okay? We never saw his face in any show, nor did the people in the show, because he never took the mask off. And he had a unique beginning, how he became this masked man. He was a Texas Ranger with his brother and 4 other Rangers. And they were ambushed, left for dead, his brother among them. He was the lone survivor. He's laying there, where it went, Tonto, come along. Tonto's alone. And he finds this man. He nurses him back to health, gets the story told to him, and Tonto says, "You, Lone Ranger." Okay. He's going to hide his identity and fight law and order. And let them think they dug 6 graves. So he remained dead. That's the story of the Lone Ranger. And what's unique about the mask is that everything that made it important was the fact that the storyline, it made sense to you. So what does this have to do with wrestling, Shire? Okay. One of the greatest gimmicks in pro wrestling was a masked man. Promoters could put a mask on anybody, and they were so brilliant. This guy comes out, and they put a mask on him, and they don't know who he is, they don't know where he came from, he doesn't have a name, and people bought it. But the gimmick was, he was beating up on the good guys, because he wanted a chance at the champion, or he wanted to get in line before somebody else, and so he would hurt people, and the good guys would try to have matches with him. In the AWA, and I'm going to go around in the country, I told you there were territories. We had like 25 to 30 different individual territories in the United States alone. And without the internet, without Google, without all today's modern day, you know, instantaneous, you can find something out. In those days, it was all a secret. So they could keep it a secret, and the promoters kept it a secret. This goes from 1958. And you see the name Dr. X. You know, what a weird name. This guy is, actually the photo is marked, it says Mr. X, but he was wrestling as Dr. X. That's always great in wrestling too. They misspell their names, they print, you know, idiots. How do I really feel about it, right, Steve? You should look at wrestling clippings. Look at wrestling clippings from the newspaper. It's amazing. It's like they had preschoolers do it. I'm sorry, but Dr. X, here's a guy who is 6'5" legit. And he comes out of Omaha. He comes out of Columbus, Ohio, and he's, by trade, he's a veterinarian. But he's also an Olympic wrestler by the name of Bill Miller. And he is a veterinarian. Dr. Bill Miller, he wrestled all over. But all of a sudden, Bill Miller was having trouble just because, as Bill Miller, oftentimes he wasn't that exciting. So in Omaha, they put a mask on him. And I say they because it's really the promotion that did this. They come out and they don't know where he comes from. I mentioned that. They don't know how much he weighs. We don't know his name. We just know him as Dr. X. Now, even as a little kid, I used to think, well, how can he come into the building, you know, with the mask on? Does he wear it? Well, then you'd look at the wrestling magazines and you'd see some of these masked wrestlers. Honest to God, they're taking a shower in the locker room with their masks on. You know, they're really going to the extreme. They're out eating at a restaurant with their masks on, okay? And then they put a picture in the magazine. We're going to take you at home with one of the wrestlers was the Claw Man, and they were going to take you at home behind the scenes. Well, lo and behold, his wife wore a mask, and so did his little kid. And he had a mask on the dog for the story. And I wish I could show you those. I have those pictures in magazines, but this is at home with the Claw Man. Okay. Well, with Bill Miller, he's wearing Vern Gagne's old title belt on there, and Bill Miller, for about 2 years, as Dr. X, just was a sellout around what they called the Omaha Territory at the time. And Omaha Territory would consist of the central states and, you know, big towns, small towns. So he did pretty good with that. Eventually, when it comes time and his gimmick's kind of worn out, they work out an angle, and guess what? He got unmasked. And my God, fans, it's Big Bill Miller. Nobody guessed this, you know? So that's kind of the story on that. There's Bill Miller, how he looks without that mask. Not ugly. A lot of times they say, well, you know, he probably wears the mask because he's deformed. You know, and the stories in the magazines say, is he a Martian? Did he come from another planet? You know, it was all built on storyline. He's a relatively good-looking guy. Outside the ring, one of the greatest in the business. And he has one of the greatest stories, and I'm just going to share it to you quickly. Wrestlers always told you the thing they hated the most about wrestling was the fans. And the reason they hated the fans because their job was to work you up, get you frustrated, get you to be angry with them. And Bill Miller, he was good at that. And one time when he was walking back from the ring to the locker room, some fan got him with a 2x4, hit him in the head.
Oh my God.
And this is legit now. Hit him in the head, and he actually had a hole in his head. We have pictures of that. And he says, you know, we just fear the fans. The fans would put cigarettes out on them when they go by, because in those days you could smoke in the arenas, cigars, whatever. And the guys would tell you, you know, they'd attack them. So they had to be careful how far they went with pushing the fans' buttons. But Bill Miller was absolutely a great wrestler, and he was successful all over the country. But anytime Bill Miller got stale, guess we didn't have, you know, all those ways to find out, but all of a sudden we'd see in the magazines, hey, there's this guy in St. Louis called the Crimson Knight wearing a mask. You know, who's he? And nobody would know. But he moved into Minneapolis in 1962, and Vern Gagne brought him in. Vern Gagne is the owner of the AWA now at this time. And Vern brings in his old buddy, Bill Miller, puts a mask on him because, you know what, we used Bill Miller 10 years ago, and we're going to bring in somebody new, and the fans will never be able to figure it out. He was so successful for over a year that TV Guide, remember TV Guide? They actually did a feature story on him. There was a story in Look magazine. I got my tango tongue up there. So yeah, he was really over as Mr. M. And when he was finally ready to go on, Vern beat him in a cage match out at the old Metropolitan Stadium. And the way he lost, they had to tell storylines. He was in a cage match, and this is when they put a cage around the ring and they're going to finish it. Vern and him are going to finish their feud. And his partner, who was Bob Geigel at the time, picked up some dirt from the infield. The ring was right on the baselines. And he picked up some dirt and he was going to throw it in Vern's face. Well, wouldn't you know, Vern just ducked and he got it in Mr. M's, and Vern turned his mask around and pinned him and beat him. And that was the end of Mr. M. So the gimmick worked. Then he was in St. Louis, as I said, as the Crimson Knight, and did that for a couple of years. They had a stupid rule in St. Louis when they brought a mask guy in. If the mask guy ever got a title shot with the champion, the mask guy had to unmask, because the NWA, which was that championship in that territory, they wouldn't allow a masked man to be champion, so he had to reveal himself. So Bill Miller got a title match, and Crimson Knight was unmasked, and guess what? It's Bill Miller. Nobody knew. But you know, when he was wrestling in Minnesota, Bill Miller, fans were confused because the magazine said Mr. M. Who is Mr. M? And you notice that's not the same guy. And that is the name that was used also by Hard-Boiled Haggerty. And the magazines are talking about this, and fans are confused. They bought it. I don't know if they would today. But yeah, we had two Mr. M's. And there's Mr. Haggerty without his mask. Nice looking dude. You guys remember Hard-Boiled Haggerty after his active wrestling career? He became quite an actor. He was in a lot of TV shows in the 80s, the 70s, and the 80s. You saw the movie Earthquake back in the day. Paint Your Wagon, another movie with Lee Marvin. H.B. Haggerty was in it. He went by H.B. in those days for his movie career. But a lot of TV shows like the Red Fox Show, regular, and quite a career. Nicest human being in the world outside the ring. And inside the ring, he was as evil as they come. And he got the name Hard Boiled because when he first came into wrestling, he was named, his real name is Don Stansock. And this corner fans, Don Stansock, who? You know, it's even hard to say. So promoter Wally Carbo decided, you know, he buzzes around the ring like a bee. I think we'll call him Don Sparrow, or a bird, you know, Don Sparrow. Well, Haggerty, or Don Stansock says, I'm not gonna be Sparrow. He says, look at this head. I'm like a hard-boiled egg. He says, well, he says, that's it, hard-boiled. Hard-boiled Haggerty. What a cool name, huh? It's ironic, he's using the picture there, you see he's got the Baron's claw hold, but that was years before the Baron ever did it. So there you go, he was a masked man too. Now I mentioned Bill Miller earlier on the right. Well, Bill had a brother. And it was interesting because when Bill was here as Mr. M and nobody knew who he was, well, Bill had a couple tag team matches that he was going to be in, and he told fans that he would go find a partner. And nobody wanted to admit at that point in time that Danny Miller was his younger brother, and legit real brother, by the way. Danny was just starting out. Ironically, he was wrestling on TV and losing right here in the Twin Cities. He would lose, and he was using the name of Harry Sampson, just a nobody. And he was getting beat. Well, Bill Miller needs a partner, so he comes up with this, I got a guy. And he comes in with this masked guy, who they're putting off as being, I think it was supposed to be Mexican, because they called him El Rojo Cara. Okay? And they had their couple matches, and then Danny Miller was gone. And Danny went on to have his own very successful career. And he also wrestled as a masked guy down in the South himself as the Gladiator for a while. And nobody knew who he was either. So that's the story of the Miller brothers. Now before I stop, you know, normally we'd have commercials, and I had a couple people ask me about the jacket, and we were talking about gimmicks, okay? Gimmicks are so important to wrestling. If you got a gimmick, you can get over, or you have to make the fans hate you. Now, all you guys know how lovable I am, right? I mean, I'm the nicest guy I know, right? Well, here, I got to be a wrestling manager for a small promotion back a while back. And I was an evil manager. I was supposed to be a bad guy. So the promoter tells me, you know, you're gonna do this and you're gonna do that. Well, I wasn't gonna get any reaction, and here was the deal. I was managing a dude by the name, he went by the name Old School, St. Holmes. And the gimmick for Old School was that he was a bad guy. He wrestled, broke illegal tactics, but he claimed to be a scientific wrestler, and therefore the name Old School, and he would put himself off as a Vern Gagne or a Jack Briscoe. So my job as his manager was I had to get in the ring, and the referee, get away from me, I'll introduce him, okay? Or the announcer, I'll introduce him. And I would tell the fans, I would say, I'm going to introduce you to the greatest professional wrestler that ever graced a ring. He's better than Jack Briscoe, Pat O'Connor, Dick Hutton, Danny Hodge, Vern Gagne, Lou Thez. You want the list to go on? This is the next champion of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Old School, Derek St. Holmes. Okay. Well, that went okay for a couple times, but then I thought, you know, I should have a jacket. Okay. And they conveniently, because I was being this arrogant dude, they conveniently named me the Authority. I was authority on Old School St. Holmes. They called me the Authority. So I told the promoter, I come in, Lorraine made the jacket for me. Okay? There you go.
Yeah.
All right. So I go into the card the next time, promoter says, what is that? I said, watch what I'm going to do. What are you going to do? I said, just watch. So I go out to the ring. I've got this jacket on. I climb into the ring. My boy Derek, Old School St. Holmes, is there. And I looked at the fans and I got the microphone. I said, I want to tell all you filthy dirt farmers out there that scrounged up your welfare money for a ticket tonight. You came in from picking cotton, whatever it is you're doing. I'm going to tell you what this A stands for. And the A stands for, and without any hint from there, the crowd started cheering, asshole, asshole, asshole. Okay? So, true. And I was so thrilled because it's exactly what I wanted them to say. And that's exactly what the wrestlers did. They would work you and try to get you to. So I went back to the locker room. And the promoter, he looks at me and says, that was genius, man. I said, I know. Thanks. But I was the Authority, but that chant. And it was great. So that was the thing with gimmicks. The wrestlers had to find a way to get you to love them or to hate them. So let's move on. Those of you that, I told them I couldn't tell the story in church because they might not like that anyway. But it stuck. Well, and I will tell you this. You know, now in my modern day life, I retired from work 16 years ago this month, and I've never regretted it. One of my old bosses is sitting right here, this sweet lady right here. And one of the things that was exciting about retiring is that I could continue to work on wrestling research. I did my books. Every day to this very day, Lorraine knows it's true. I work something on wrestling, whether it be research, looking something up, writing something, contributing to other books, the whole thing. That's what I live for. So, back to this. This is a guy named Bobby Graham. And I'll tell you how sometimes the promotions would confuse you because it's like they didn't pay attention to what they did yesterday. Bobby Graham comes into the AWA and they introduce him and he wrestles on a couple of cards right here in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and they introduce him as Bobby Graham. Third card comes on. There's a guy named Irish Pat Kennedy on the card. And it was Bobby Graham. It's like you forgot his name. Well, Bobby Graham says, I didn't like that Graham name. His real name was Larry Hullen, or Hullen. It's H-U-L-I-N, Hullen. And that's not a good name, in this corner, Larry Hullen, boring. Bobby Graham, that's got more Sam to it. But anyway, he was Irish Pat Kennedy. Well, the reason he took the name was, Vern says, well, Bobby Graham wasn't doing anything, but people are gaga over President Kennedy right now. This is 1961. President Kennedy. So he's Irish Pat Kennedy. There you go. And he kind of lived the gimmick. He went on to be a mask guy and made a lot of money. Nobody knew who he was. He was the Mighty Hercules. That's an original name, right? But he had a mask, Mighty Hercules. Made a lot of money. He also did a lot of tag teams in different areas with a bunch of different names. There's a picture of him with the mask. That's Bobby Graham right there. And the night Mighty Hercules was unmasked, and the guy that's in the headlock there in the blue trunks, ironically, his name is Eddie Graham. Okay? But Mighty Hercules in that particular issue was unmasked. And look who's on the other side. That guy named Gorgeous George. And since I mentioned that again, I want to tell you for gimmicks. So poor Gorgeous George. We get to 1963. He's now older, and George had one problem. He liked the ladies. He'd been married like 7 times, legit. He even had, he had kids that he didn't know about. So you're kind of guessing he wasn't the most responsible gentleman. And he loved loved to drink. Well, he drank so much that towards 1962 and 3, he was becoming a little unreliable in the business. And the promoters were getting a little leery of using him. And he was down on his luck. He ended up having sclerosis of the liver. Well, in 1963, he was kind of down on the dumps and he needed to have a payday. So he went to a guy that we're going to talk about a little later and asked him to do a match for him. And it just so happened the guy he went to was a mask guy. And he went to him and says, I got a favor to ask of you. Why don't we have a match where I will put my hair, my blonde, curly hair, up against you in a match, and if I lose, I shave my head. If you lose, you unmask. Well, we know the guy wasn't going to unmask. So George lost, and they shaved him. Pictures in the ring, they're shaving his locks off, you know. He got paid well for it, but there you go. That was the end of his career. And then he died on Christmas Eve of 1963 at the age of 49. So he's a pretty young dude. Didn't take care of his health. But the money he made for the business, as we talked about with his gimmick, he was the original. Okay, that's an original name for a masked wrestler, isn't it? What are we going to call you? I don't know, masked man. Okay, kind of like I pick up my daughter Amy because she's here. She'd have a stuffed doll or a stuffed animal when she was little, and we'd say, you know, what's the animal's name? Bear, cat. Okay, never gave it a name. So he was Masked Man. Well, here's the deal with Masked Man. He's wrestling in the AWA Twin Cities area, and his real name, Tony Nero, N-E-R-O. People see him every week on TV and on a wrestling card at the arena. And then in February of 1965, Harley Race was injured when Larry Hennig and him were tag team champions. And I've told you guys the story, I think last time, about Harley Race, handsome Harley Race, one of the greatest villains in the world. He was at the Chestnut Club, a nightclub in downtown Minneapolis. And there were 3 guys beating up on a lady. The manager of the Chestnut Club came to Harley, and because he knew he was a wrestler, and he came to him to intervene. Harley went up, he took 2 of the guys out, literally. And this is in the newspapers, and I have clippings of these too. This made the papers in Minneapolis, St. Paul. He took 2 of the guys out, but the 3rd guy came up behind Harley and got him in the back with a knife. And Harley had, up on this side and the right side, he had like a moon-shaped scar. He was in the hospital. Next day it made the papers. Harley Race is, you know, out of action. And Larry Hennig needed a partner. Well, what are you going to do with Larry? You're the tag team champion. Harley can't wrestle. What are we going to do? Larry comes in with, I got a partner, Masked Man. Nobody knew who this guy was. Well, it was Tony Nero. And everybody's seen him, but I'm telling you the truth, nobody ever guessed that Tony Nero was Masked Man for over a month. And then when Harley came back, there was Tony Nero in the bottom matches of the cards. Nobody made any big deal of it. But he earned a little bit of money while he was doing that. And that was his gimmick. He took that same gimmick and he came up with a better name. He went out east and he became, oh boy. I'm old, I can have a senior moment. It'll come to me. He was a masked guy in New York. But the same mask. So, the long story short, he had a short career as Masked Man. Okay? The Shadow. How could I forget that? Okay? There he is. There's Prince, and he wrestled as Prince Tony Nero. So he looks like a pretty good dude, doesn't he? Decent built back in the day. Here's one of my favorites. When I was 12 years old, now you got to remember, and I'm going to tell you guys, because I know I worked in a bank, I could figure this out, but I know maybe you guys need a little more time. Oh boy, George, heel. I was 12 years old in 1963. That tells you I'm 106 now. This guy, good guy, he's the baby face. Baby faces for the good guys. And you see the outfit he's wearing. Moose Evans was 6'4.5" tall. Came into the ring with that cut-off flannel shirt and those blue jeans. He had a rope that he put, you can just see it at the beginning, but he had a rope, he didn't use a belt. and he was Moose Evans. As if you had to call somebody Moose that was 6'4", you know, let's call him Moose. Well, I was so enamored with him as a 12-year-old kid. And you know, we'd go outside and we'd play, we're gonna pretend wrestle. Well, I always had to be Moose Evans. And I had a pair of jeans like that, and I had a shirt like that. And man, I felt like Moose Evans, you know. Moose Evans, the reason I put his picture up there is, this is one of the strangest stories of any wrestler I have ever researched and come across. He started in the business in 1960. This was about 1963. And by 1967, his career was done. I mean, he left. Nobody knew where he went. We never heard from him again. Every wrestler we've ever asked, or I've ever asked, they don't know what happened to him. He just literally disappeared. And he just left the business. But in that 7 years, from 60 to 67, he traveled around the country in various identities and gimmicks and was really sought after and made a lot of money. Right there, the guy in the front, the left side there, that's Moose Evans. He was one of the Mighty Yankees. And his partner was, they billed him as Mighty Yankee number 1 and number 2. You know, I don't know if I want to be billed anything number 2. But there they were. They come in the ring and do that pose. And they were eventually unmasked and revealed to be Moose Evans, and the other guy was Bob Stanley. Well, it was interesting because, remember I told you we couldn't find out what was going on in another town back in those days? We really didn't know without any of the access we do today. Well, while these two are wrestling in the South as the Mighty Yankees, they're also doing some work up in Toronto. Oops, wrong one. Okay, they're doing work up in Toronto, and they're wrestling as brothers, Giant and Moose Evans. Okay, and without the masks, so they did a lot of fun stuff. All right, let's get to that next picture that you saw. Doug Gilbert, Reggie Parks. Two good guys, two baby faces. Boy, the fans loved these two. And Reggie Parks, the guy with the muscular build standing up there, he had one of the unique gimmicks of the business where he had a cast iron stomach. Okay? You could punch him, you could jump on him, whatever you do, you couldn't hurt him. Reggie would have challenges. You know, you want to prove it? Go ahead, here you go. You know, or he'd lay down, let him come off the top rope on him, you know. His stomach was, that was his cast iron stomach. And he did such great things, even, and I'm going to move forward just a second. Right there. That was on TV. They had a Volkswagen bus drive over his abdomen, and he would show you that he had a cast iron stomach. Okay? I'll get back here. Doug Gilbert, the other guy, and I'm going to tell you, we'll go back to Parks in a second, but Doug Gilbert, he was like one of the greatest baby faces in the business. I mean, everywhere he went, the ladies loved him, the fans loved him, he was popular. And he was known as Mr. High. The reason they called him Mr. High is because he was an acrobat. He would get up on the top rope and do the back flip off and somersault across the ring and drop kick his opponents. So he was very acrobatic. One of the things that was unique about Doug Gilbert too was that amazingly his weight fluctuated throughout his career. He could go and be bigger, and then all of a sudden you'd see him smaller, and then all of a sudden he'd be bigger. He just seemed to be one of those guys that it just happened to, and he worked with it. Well, he found out though that as a babyface, he still wasn't getting the big matches from the promoters that he wanted. So he came up with an idea. There's Doug Gilbert. And he's calling himself the Professional. And you remember I talked about old school St. Holmes where he was supposedly this scientific wrestler but broke every rule in the book when the referee was out buying popcorn and couldn't see him do it? The Professional did that. And for about 3 years, he was one of the hottest attractions in the wrestling business as the Professional. And nobody knew who he was. Well, Reggie Parks, not to be denied, he went and called himself the Avenger. cast iron stomach, you can still see the build. It's amazing people didn't recognize it. I mean, I think it looks like the same guy. The thing with Reggie, though, is he was different because he was a good guy as a masked man. That was unique because it was weird. When the guy was a bad guy, the fans wanted to see him get unmasked so they could see this unknown person they didn't know anyway. But when they were a good guy, when the opponent would pull the mask, they, he's pulling the mask, ref, stop him. They don't want to see who it is. So as a baby face, you were popular. So he had a career as that. Now I do want to touch on Reggie for one more thing. Title belts in wrestling were very important back in the day. And tag teams would have title belts, champions would have title belts. Well, Reggie Parks and Doug Gilbert, who you saw just a minute ago, they were in Omaha, Nebraska. And they won the Midwest Tag Team Championship. And they went to the promoter, Joe Dusick, and they said, we're the champions, we should have title belts. And Dusick says, title belts? I don't have money for title belts. I'm barely making it here, guys. I don't have money. Reggie says, well, that's bogus. We're champs. We got to have something. So Reggie went out and he made 2 belts, physically made title belts. And him and Doug Gilbert were wearing these belts. And then they became the Midwest Tag Team belts when they eventually left the territory. But what was so cool about it is that Reggie did such a good job with it that in about 5 or 6 years, his career was starting to slow down as a wrestler. And he had promoters from all over the country, in Japan and Australia and New Zealand and in Germany, asking him to make title belts for them. And he ended up making probably 90% of the title belts that anybody ever saw in wrestling after that. He'd make it for the promotion, he had prices. And he made a living doing title belts. So it happened by accident, There's another picture, and this is Doug Gilbert again. One thing about Doug Gilbert is you can always look at his eyes, and you can always tell he had those very distinctive eyes. Well, he goes into Indianapolis, and he's introduced as the professor, and he's talking about it's an education when you get in the ring with me, and I'm going to show you how to wrestle, and I'm the professor. He wasn't the professional, and he had about Indianapolis. He had maybe 3-4 cards he was on. And then all of a sudden the next card comes out and they're introducing the professor. And believe it or not, nobody knew that the professor under the mask was not Doug Gilbert. It was that guy. Dale Lewis took it over. He was the professor. They never explained the difference. And I don't know if Doug had a beef with the promoter and decided to take his toys and go home. I don't know. But fans were never told Dale Lewis took over as the professor. A little bit about Dale Lewis. He was a wrestler trained by Vern Gagne. Very good Olympic wrestler, amateur champion out of Oklahoma. He was the real deal, guys. He was one of those wrestlers that if you got cute with him and you didn't want to work with him in a ring to make the match work so that you could have a good guy, bad guy, and have an ending come to what the conclusion is supposed to be to continue the story. Well, Dale was one of those guys that could kind of, here's your arm. I didn't even know you took it off. That's what he did. So he was very well respected and very well liked. Mr. Wrestling number 1. Gotta have another number 2. Mr. Wrestling number 1. There's such a nice story about this guy. And I do want to point out to you that every one of these wrestlers, it was usually the same thing. Fans in this corner weighing in at 232 pounds. We don't know where he comes from. We do not know his name. He is Mr. Wrestling. Okay. Well, Mr. Wrestling was also an amateur champion, and he was also an Olympic wrestler by the name of George Woodin. Woodin. But he never wrestled under that name. He was always wrestling when he was without the mask as Tim Woods. And he was always a babyface. He never wrestled as a heel. So even as Mr. Wrestling, you can tell he's a good guy because he has a white mask and white trunks and white boots, right? Good guys wear white. It was simple back in those days. You put the black on, you're the bad guy. You put the white on, you're the good guy. Okay, he was very popular with that gimmick, Mr. Wrestling, and he would be one of those guys that would go in and he'd actually work matches and show scientific holds, as they call them. And kind of an interesting side story to him is that in 1975 there was a plane crash. But wrestlers started in the 70s really going a lot of places by plane and not driving as much as they've done in the past. And up in the plane, boy, I'm trying to think of the guys that were in the plane with them. Bobby Shane, some wrestler. It won't mean any difference to you. But the newspaper report, one of the wrestlers was killed, Bobby Shane, in the crash. One of the wrestlers. Well, one of the wrestlers that wasn't mentioned as being in the plane crash was Tim Woods. But George Wooden was mentioned in the newspaper, and nobody knew who George Wooden was. But he was out of action for a while in the plane crash. And ended up wrestling again, but wasn't quite the same. But again, we have a number one. There's Tim Woods. Look at that, clean-cut looking guy back then in the 60s and the 70s. It's the guy you want to bring home to mom, right? Well, look at this guy, Johnny Walker. He decided he wanted to take the name of a whiskey, I guess. Isn't there a whiskey, Johnny Walker?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can see he's a nice-looking guy. And his initial wrestling, he had a unique ability where he was able to just contort his body and twist his legs, you know, double jointed. He did all kinds of crazy things. And so in his initial outings, he was called Rubber Man, Johnny Walker. And I should have put the picture on here. I didn't, did I? No. George. He has a picture where his legs are up over his arms and he's just all contorted. Rubber Man, Johnny Walker. But you know what? As a good guy, he wasn't happy with his push. He wasn't happy with what he was getting on. So he decided, I'm going to become a villain. I'm going to put a mask on. Nobody's going to know where I'm from. And he became the Grappler. Okay? The Grappler. Look at him. Mr. Arrogance there. And he did this for a couple of years down in the southern states. Well, you know, it's funny because wrestling promoters counted on wrestling fans having nanosecond memories. They didn't want you to remember anything that happened last week unless they wanted you to remember what happened last week. So the Grappler eventually is gone. Johnny Walker showed up again for a while. But then Mr. Wrestling number one needed a partner. So he comes up with Mr. Wrestling 2. And the other reason I labeled it number 2 like that was for my own purposes, but that is the Roman numeral that he used when he was number 2. And again, you look at him, his mask is a little bit different than Tim Wood's mask. But they took this gimmick so seriously that in 1976, you guys may remember, if you remember Jimmy Carter, our president, Miss Lillian, his mother, it was mentioned a few times during the presidency that she was a wrestling fan. Miss Lillian was. And she loved Mr. Wrestling. Okay? So the papers, they made a story out of the fact that Jimmy Carter had invited Mr. Wrestling to come to the White House and meet his mother. And there is a picture of her with Mr. Wrestling, but Mr. Wrestling says, well, I can't come to the White House. I can't do that. The Secret Service wanted him to take the mask off and come in. He says, I can't do that. People will learn my identity. Well, hey, dummies, we saw your face all over for the past 23 years. Okay? But that's how far they carried the gimmick. So he really didn't go to the White House. And Miss Lillian, they had to set up this special meeting, but it couldn't be at the White House. Kind of an interesting story. He ended up wrestling right up to the end as Mr. Wrestling 2. And kind of a fun side story for him. Most of you will remember some of the robes that Ric Flair wore. If you remember Ric Flair, he seemed to have every imaginable flowing color, bright rainbow robes, and he'd do his strut. Johnny Walker's wife made all those robes for Ric Flair. Lots of them. And she made ring jackets for a lot of the wrestlers. Not as good as mine. She made those things. So Ric Flair can credit Johnny Walker. Here's a good guy. Cowboy Bill Watts. This guy is what I guess you'd call him an enigma. He started wrestling in the early 60s. He played football for Oklahoma. Come out of Bud Wilkinson's direction. and he took up wrestling. Legit, he was about 6'4", and close to 300 pounds, so he wasn't a small boy. And this is pretty much the way he looked. This picture is from 1969. Well, he started wrestling in the East Coast in 1963, and the way he got into the business, I'll share this with you. Anybody hear of Wahoo McDaniel, the Indian wrestler, Wahoo McDaniel? Wahoo was a former football player for the Jets, Miami Dolphins. He played for the Oilers at one point. Well, he started wrestling, this is Wahoo now. He started wrestling during the off season from football because, you know, again, in those days, football players didn't have the huge contracts they do today. So he would take up wrestling over the summer months. And he was making great money. So one night he's sitting in a bar and Bill Watts is there. And Wahoo takes out this money, a lot of money to pay for drinks or buy a round or whatever. And, you know, Watts asked him, he said, "What the hell did you do? You rob a bank or what?" He said, "I got it wrestling." "What?" You know, Watts says, "What do you mean you got wrestling?" And supposedly the figure was a lot of money. And Watts says, "Hell, I can kick the you know what out of you right now. But what do I got to do to get in this business?" So that's how Bill Watts got in the business. And he learned how to work. Well, he was in Madison Square Garden in the early 60s, and there was a guy named Bruno Sammartino who was the champion. And by 1965, he'd been champ for a couple of years. He was teaming with Cowboy Bill Watts in tag team matches. They did the storyline where Bill Watts wanted to have a chance at Bruno's title. You know, "I'm big, I'm strong, I've got a good record, I want to have a chance to wrestle the champion." Bruno, "I'm busy, I can't, you know, you've got to get in line with the rest of the challengers," and you know, the whole story. So they're in tag team matches. Well, Bill Watts is increasingly getting more frustrated. And during one tag team match, the guy snapped, he decked Sammartino and walked out on him. And of course, now guess what? Bruno says, "You know what, you're not going to get away with that. You got a match, buddy." And that's how the promoters did this stuff. There had to be a reason for it to happen. And now he was one of the most hated villains. You got to remember, in Madison Square Garden, that they drew 22,000. Bruno Sammartino drew over 20,000 for 12 years straight in the Garden, once a month. So he was a draw. And 20,000 in arenas back then was big. The matches with Watts went over so well that some of you remember the magazine, the Saturday Evening Post? Okay. Well, they did a story on the rich, good life of a bad guy. And it was Cowboy Bill Watts. And they played it up, you know, that he takes the business seriously and he's going to be the champion and he'll take out anybody he has to. Well, then Bill got in trouble with the law. And we will just leave that alone. But he ended up leaving the country for about a year and a half. When he came back, he went to St. Louis. And he's kind of coming back into the business, but he's got to come in slowly because, you know, Bill Watts was kind of banned, okay? You see that little picture down in the corner there? Dr. Scarlet. Purple robe, purple mask, purple trunks underneath. Nobody knows who he is, nobody knows where he comes from. And he wants to be the next guy to get a champion match with Gene Kiniski, who at that time was their champion, the world champion. Well, again, remember I mentioned that goofy rule in St. Louis, that if the masked guy got a title shot, he had to unmask, and there you see the headlines. Win or lose, Dr. Scarlet to unmask to get the match with Kiniski, and he did. And oh my God, it's Bill Watts, holy cow. You know, it was great. What's interesting about this, though, at the very same time this was going on, and this is from 1968. So in St. Louis and some of the surrounding towns and cities, Dr. Scarlet is the scourge. But here in Minnesota and the AWA territory, we've got the most popular wrestler on the scene, Cowboy Bill Watts. He was working both territories, and nobody knew. Well, I did, but. So I used to collect, I told you guys I used to collect the programs and get them from all the cities, so there you go. But that was Dr. Schire. He was just a heck of a good worker. And when he came into work for Vern Gagne usually was the most popular wrestler, When he was on the card, attendance went up. A Crusher, when he was on the card, attendance went up. In 1969, they did a popularity contest. Now, remember, we're talking wrestling, so we don't know if they rigged it or not. But Bill Watts was the most popular wrestler, and they had a list of all the guys and supposedly all the votes they got, you know, and I don't know if the ballots were stuffed or what. We've never heard of a ballot being wrong. So, there was Bill Watts, the most popular wrestler. Well, Bill Watts wanted to have a match with Vern Gagne, because Vern Gagne's the champion, right? And he's a good guy. Well, wouldn't you know, Vern needs a partner for some matches, so he says, I got to get the best guy in the business to be my partner. I'm going to ask Bill Watts to be partners. They're playing it up, Vern is keeping Watts at bay by having him team with him, so he doesn't have to phase him. Can Vern beat Bill Miller? And they play that out. Eventually, Bill Watts got his title match with Vern, and they did this program really good because it was 4 matches in each city, but they didn't do them successively. One was in April, this was 69. One was in April, one was in June, one was in November, and the following one was in December. And Vern Gagne said on the December card, this is the last time I'm wrestling this guy. Win or lose, we're done. I can't wrestle this guy every month or every week. Well, Bill Watts was leaving the territory, so guess who lost? Bill Watts went down to the South, Mid-South, Oklahoma, Louisiana, etc., and he started his own promotion that became very, very popular and big in the later 70s. So that's the story of Bill Watts. The champion's name is Dick Beyer. And I know some of you know this story already. This to me is one of the favorite stories of all time. That guy in the corner right there, that's Dick Beyer. And Dick Beyer was an amateur champion. He was a great swimmer. He was a coach. He started wrestling in 1954 as plain old Dick Beyer up in Syracuse, New York. He wasn't going anywhere big. He was, sometimes he'd be in the main event, but most of the time an undercard. And he did well until 1962. He happened to be in Hawaii. And he was working against a guy named Maurice Mad Dog Machon. Dick Beyer's the good guy now. Well, Mad Dog really liked him. He said, this guy was fun to work with. So he got a hold of the promoter up in Los Angeles, a guy named Jules Strongbow. He says, I got a guy down, there's a guy down here you need to get. Jules says, all right, get him up here. Dick calls him, he says, yeah, I want you to come in. So Dick goes out and he has these, he says, we're going to use you as a heel. That was new to Dick. He says, yeah, I'm okay with it. So he got some mug shots made and, scrunched his face a little bit. And he gets up to Los Angeles and Jules Strongbow says, here. And he throws him. You know what a potato sack looks like? Itchy, scratchy potato sack. Well, this thing that Jules Strongbow threw Dick Beyer was that type of material, and it fit around the crotch, up, over, and it had a hood and a mask. Completely covered. That was going to be his ring outfit. And Beyer says, what is this? You're not going to be Dick Beyer. We're calling you the Destroyer. What? Okay, as long as you pay me. So Dick goes out. And this is in June of 62. He goes out, he wrestles. This was the worst, and Dick told this story. He said, this was the worst experience of my life. He says, I was so hot. I was scratching all over. I had a rash. He said, I was so uncomfortable. He says, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't get any air. And he gets back to the locker room, and he takes this stupid thing off, and he throws it. And he says, that's the last time I'm going to wear that. And he probably had an expletive for it. Well, the promoter says, but you've got to be the Destroyer. And I'm not gonna do it. Well, there's a wrestler sitting over in the corner with his duffel bag open, and he reaches in. Ox Anderson was the guy's name. It doesn't mean anything to you, but Ox Anderson, he reaches in his duffel bag and he throws, says, Dick, here, try this. It was a mask. Dick takes it, puts it on, and you see the way the mask is right there, the white mask with the stripe on it? That's similar to what Ox Anderson's mask was, okay? Now the unique thing is that you see it had the eye openings good, His nose was open so that he could breathe. And the mouth had enough space. And Dick puts it on and he's kind of fitting it and adjusting. He says, God, this is good. I can work with this. And he says, what's it made out of? And Oxander says, woman's girdle. What? And it's stretched. Okay, and you can see the white material. And Dick says, well, this is great. I'm going with this. So Dick and his wife Wilma, they go to the Woolworth stores in Los Angeles, and he makes it sound like they went to several. Woolworths was a prominent store back in that day. But they went to the Woolworth stores, and Dick says, me and Wilma, we're standing there, and I'm trying on these girdles and and then they bought them, and Wilma goes home, and she made him tons of masks. And so that stripe and that rim you see, it would always be a white mask. But some of them would have a black stripe and rim, some would have a green, some would have a blue, some would have a red. So the Destroyer did have the same mask but a different mask. And he had these things made out of a woman's girdle. And that's just such a great story. And then he'd have it under the chin where you see it goes, and then on the back there's a tie so that he could, tighten. But whenever an opponent, because the gimmick now, he's a bad guy. So the gimmick for the baby face is to, let's find out who this guy is. We don't know where he comes from, okay? And so they're going to try to pull it off. Well, with the stretchiness, they could take the top of it and pull it out, stretch it. And the pictures are always so great with graphic because they're kind of getting him. He's got his teeth holding onto it, And so the Destroyer was so successful for the next 5 years. He was in California, he went to Texas, he went to the Central States, he went to Indianapolis, he went to Japan as the Destroyer, and he made a deal that 99% of the other mask guys could never make. Told the promoters, he says, I will not unmask. You're never going to take this mask off of me because I'm making money with this. So he's in business for himself and a smart move. And the promoters, they agreed to it because he was such a good draw. So he had a good gimmick. He wasn't going to be unmasked. Normally with a masked man, I will tell you, the general consensus was that masked man would say, I won't take my mask off until I'm beaten 2 out of 3 pinfalls or submissions. Otherwise, I don't take it off. So, they could always work the matches where there was one fall that was screwy, got disqualified or whatever it was, and so they got to keep their mask for another day. So now we flash forward to Indianapolis in 1967, and the Destroyer is working for the Indianapolis wrestling office. And they go into Chicago for a match. The Destroyer had earned, well, let me back up. Chicago was a unique city. It was run by 2 different promotions, the AWA and the WWA out of Indianapolis. And unique to Chicago was they got wrestlers from both groups. Unique because they got to see wrestlers in matches that everybody else surrounding them never got to see. So that was kind of cool. Well, the Destroyer was working for Indianapolis, but because Chicago was unique, he ended up getting a title shot with a guy named Vern Gagne, who was the AWA champion. And Vern, after the match, he was very impressed. He liked working with Dick Fire. So he says to one of the guards, he said, take this note to Buyer. And the note was, he wanted to meet him at the downtown Playboy Club to have drinks, of course. Well, Vern wanted to talk to him while coming into the AWA. So they're at the Playboy Club talking about the Destroyer coming in, and it got kind of fuzzy because Dick Buyer, he says, well, Vern, I'm not unmasking. Vern says, well, yeah, you got to unmask eventually, when the run is, 2 or 3 years, when your run is done, we got to reveal. I'm not unmasking. He says, Vern, we've had this discussion with other promoters. Vern says, all right, well, Dick, I need you. You worked so good tonight, and we can make money together. He says, so we'll come up with something different. The guy with the black mask, you notice now the nose piece is on there, the mouth is a little bit more tighter, not as opening around the eyes. And Vern Gagne comes up with the idea. He says, all right, Dick, here's what we're going to do. They used to have studio TV matches. They'd have the ring, you'd have a row of seats like we have here, you got your ring, and then you'd have your TV, you're watching it at home. Well, the one TV show, the announcers are talking and the match that's going on in the ring, whoever it was. And one of the announcers makes the comment, he says, there's a fan in the front row wearing a mask. That's all they said. You know, just kind of making fun of this person sitting right in the front row. And the camera shot in on him for a second. Week number 2 comes by. They make an announcement. You know that fan that had the mask on, he's here again tonight. That's it. Okay, nothing. We get to week number 3. During the course of the show, they do interviews after the wrestlers have their matches. They do an interview with them to talk about the arena card coming down. Well, the guy in the mask had a suit and tie on. He gets up, he comes over to Marty O'Neill, the announcer on TV, and he interrupts him. He says, excuse me. And he's got this mask on, this mask right here. He says, I want to have a match with one of these wrestlers. And he was very calm, very quiet. I want to have a match with one of these wrestlers. Excuse me, you're going to have to go sit down. Promoter comes out, sir, you're going to have to go have a seat, or we're going to. And then Bob O'Brien, who was the security guard, he comes out, he says, sir, have a seat. The mask guy goes back. Now we get to week number 5. Number 5. The masked man comes out one more time. He says, I would like to have a match with one of these wrestlers. Sir, you're going to have to go sit down. So he goes and sits down. Well, a little bit later on that same TV card, the AWA World Heavyweight Champion Vern Gagne is in a match on TV against a guy named Jack Pesek. And Vern Gagne, if you guys knew, his finishing hold was he'd clamp a sleeper hold on his opponent and put him out, put him to sleep, and he wins. Well, during the course of the match, now here's the row of seats, there's this masked guy. And Vern gets up there and he's got clamps the sleeper hold on Jack Pesek, and he's got it on there. The masked guy climbs out of his chair, jumps up on the ring apron, goes up on the top rope, comes down right on the neck of Vern Gagne from behind. Vern falls down, and this masked guy puts a figure 4 leg lock on him in the middle of the ring. And Vern is screaming and yelling, and he's been hit, Uncle, I give up. A couple seconds later, this masked guy, fans, we don't know how the champion is. We'll keep you posted. They're carrying him out. We're Vern Gagne. Let's start a sympathy crusade. This masked guy comes over. Now he's not polite. He says to Marty O'Neill, he says, for the past 3 weeks I've come out here and I've asked like a gentleman to get a match with one of these wrestlers. You treated me like an idiot and made me sit down. He says, I want a match. I can't get a match. Well, I just beat your world champion. Wally Carbo comes out, the promoter. You want to, Wally Carbo, nobody can imitate him. He was stumbled and stammered over his words, but it was his part. He says, you want a match? You got it. You're wrestling the Crusher tonight. Whoa! Right for TV. They used to run the wrestling card right after the show ended. So, oh my gosh, the Crusher. Fans right away thought, well, this guy's going to be a flash in the pan. Nobody beats the Crusher. He was the guy. That night, they only introduced him in the ring, and this was the second time this happened now. They only introduced him in the ring that night as the Masked Man. He ended up beating Crusher. The following week, comes out on TV. Marty O'Neill says, what's your name? It's none of your business. Why are you wearing a mask? Because I've tried to get matches with all these different wrestlers, wrestling as myself, and nobody wants to wrestle me. Nobody wants to sign a contract. So I had to put a mask on and hide my identity. Okay, well, what's your name? You can call me Dr. X. That was it. And he became Dr. X. So he was a bad guy. Now we got with him, and I will point out that in the wrestling magazines, they would have official rankings of the wrestlers, 1 through 50. The Destroyer, who was always up near 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 in the rankings, all of a sudden when this guy Dr. X appeared, the Destroyer was way down at number 27, 28, What happened to the Destroyer? He's not around. Nobody ever figured it out. So we get to the 3-year mark. Dr. X has been the hated #1 villain. They had him wrestle literally everybody. The Mighty Igor, the Crusher, Cowboy Bill Watts. So many wrestlers that came in, they were going to be the ones to take the mask off, and they all failed. Well, Dick got, I just say he got a little itchy to travel. And in June of 1970, he went to Vern Gagne, and he said, I want to take a year off from the AWA. I planned a world tour. And this is the truth, he did. He planned his own tour, New Zealand, Japan, he went to Germany, Singapore, Australia. He planned a world tour with his family, and he was going to be working as the destroyer. And then, technically, he was thinking he might come back after a year. But they had to figure out a way to get rid of him. How could he just disappear? So Vern says, well, we'll have to come up with a way to unmask you. And Dick was okay with that because the destroyer was never going to unmask. But nobody cares that Dr. X is unmasked. So they had a few matches around the circuit, different wrestlers. Blackjack Lanza and Paul Diamond are two names that you might know. Each of them took their turn at being the one to unmask Dr. X in their town. But he was never revealed when the name was given as Dick Byer. He was revealed as Bruce Marshall. And it was a joke because there were two guys. There was an advertising guy in some department store that advertised on the TV wrestling up there, and they took the two names and put them together, and that was Dr. X. But it come time for his unmasking in St. Paul. And I don't know why they did this, it was weird. They started in June, and he was going to leave in August. So they were going to kind of play the cards for the 3 months to lead up to his leaving. And I think I have the next picture here. There was the Dr. X Vern Gagne match from Chicago that I talked about when they went to the Playboy Club afterwards. And it's funny, you see the mask of the guy in the picture, that's not Dick Byer. That's the mask of the Mighty Hercules that we talked about earlier, Bobby Graham. Promoters figured, they just put a mask guy on their fans, not going to know any difference. Fans are dumb. That was Bobby Graham. Anyway, that was that. Okay, so we get to Dr. X now. He's going to unmask. And there's a great story here. He is going to be leaving the AWA. And this story appeared. This is page 1 of a clipping that took place in the Minneapolis paper. What happened here was they figured all these wrestlers had tried to unmask Dr. X, and everybody failed. Well, we got an idea. We'll bring back Mr. M from 6 years ago. Nobody remembers that he was unmasked and he was Bill Miller. So guess what, fans? Mr. M is coming back, and we're going to have an alphabet match, X versus M. Well, the newspaper goes, they have Mr. M come in, and what was unique about Mr. M when he came in was he had these red tights, a red mask, and the only reason it was so convenient for him is because, remember I told you he was in St. Louis wrestling as the Crimson Knight. So he comes in as Mr. M. Something happened in that match. There's the other half of the story. And the whole gist of the story is that the reporter, did they have the reporter's name on there? John Gilbert. Through the whole story, John Gilbert is revealing that he's Dick Byer. But it was on purpose. And they misspelled Byer as Byers, B-Y-E-R-S instead of B-E-Y-E-R. But, he's Dr. X all right, but the promoters won't tell you because, and if any of the wrestlers fall off, they won't have a job. But it's the story they revealed it. So anyway, we get to this second. So what happened was Mr. M comes in, and by this time, Dr. X had taken on, he figured he needed somebody to watch his back because all these wrestlers are after his mask. So he decided, I got to come up with a super secret partner. We'll call him Double X. Okay? Now, you see Double X is the one on the left up there. He's got 2 X's on the top of his mask. I mean, you have to tell us that he's XX. And they did. Seriously, they were almost carbon copies of each other. They had the same build, they wore the same outfits, so they were playing tricks on the referee. They'd hide their mask and switch places. Well, in his match with Mr. M, strangely enough, the referee got knocked down. Okay? He was unable to see what was going to happen here. And Dr. X fell out of the ring, and out from under the ring comes He comes back up, and the fans are yelling, "That's not him, that's double X, that's double X." And the referee's like, "What, huh? You know? And M throws double X down, pins him, and pulls off his mask, and he reveals him to be this guy named Jim Osborne. Okay? Well, what's weird about that is that before Dr. X had taken him as his super secret partner, just 2, 3, 4, and 5 weeks earlier, Jim Osborne was wrestling on the cards in the Twin Cities as Jim Osborne. Nobody figured it out. But that newspaper article tells that. So we get to this double identity thing. Well, now that double X has been exposed, Dr. X is back on his own. So he decided he'd hook up with Bobby the Brain Heenan. Who, by the way, wasn't the brain back then. He was still Pretty Boy Bobby Heenan.
Pretty boy.
But he hooked up with Bobby Heenan, who was managing Blackjack Lanza. Can you get two better guys to work with? Well, they're on a TV match. And they're wrestling against two somebodies, didn't matter. And wouldn't you know, Lanza and Dr. X, they kind of got their signals messed up. And Heenan and Lanza started pushing him. And Dr. X, he decked them both, and their teamwork was done. But that night, in the auditorium, they were scheduled to team up against Red Bastille and Pepper Gomez. Well, Broder on the spot had to change the card because Dr. X said, after what just happened here, I want Lanza, and I want him now. Okay, you got him tonight, we'll switch the card around. So they flipped the tag team match and made it different. So that night, Lanza pulled his mask off. Well, wouldn't you know that Dr. X conveniently had a big white towel handy and he was able to cover up his face and get back to the locker room. We don't know who he is. But he got beat up pretty bad, but he wanted a rematch. And the long story short on it is he comes out and he tells the promoters, he says, you know, 3 years I've been here. You've put me against everybody you want. You wanted my mask. I have beaten everybody. I want a match with Lanza. I don't know if I can get Lanza to wrestle you. I don't know if Bobby Heenan will agree to the match. You're not listening to me, Doc says. I want a match with him. He said, I'm going to tell you something. You want this mask. Give me a match with Lanza. I'm going to take the mask off. You will what? You got yourself a match. We have Lanza against, going to be the unmasked man. Now, Dr. X comes in the ring that night in St. Paul, stands in the corner like he usually does with his mask on. And conveniently, Marty O'Neill, the ring announcer, knew everything about him now. Comes in, and he says, fans in this corner, he comes from Syracuse University, where he's a swimming coach, a great amateur wrestler, a long-time champion in the business, Dick Beyer. And Dick takes his mask off and hands it to the promoter. And he wrestled the match without the mask. Lanza won. Doc was gone. Next week's program says, what happened to Dr. X? Will we ever see him again? We don't know. He disappeared. And that's what he wanted because he was going to be gone. Okay? He promised he was going to leave for a year to burn. There's Dick Beyer in his younger years. The one thing that was interesting is that nobody ever knew that he was the Destroyer, but he always wore the same white Destroyer boots as Dick Beyer. I don't know. That looking outside the box didn't seem to exist. And that's how Jim Osborne looked. You can see that he's got a lot of the similarities of Dick Beyer. Now, what was interesting about this, and this is how fans were confused. So the Destroyer goes on this world tour. Double X, Jim Osborne, leaves the AWA and he goes down to the Mid-South, and now he's wrestling that was Dr. X when he left. I always got a kick out of it when he signed that for me. I don't know if he did it in printing like that or I don't know, but he didn't write it. Okay, so Dr. Double X leaves and he goes down to the Mid-South, and surprisingly enough, he's wrestling as Dr. X. And now in the magazines, they're flipping you across and you go, well, the Destroyer's wrestling and Dr. X is still wrestling. So nobody figured out that Dr. X was Jim Osborne down there. And he continued to do that for the rest of his career, which was about another 8 or 9 years, Jim Osborne was Dr. X. This is when Dr. X came back and he's now wearing a white mask. He comes back after this world tour. And he comes back and everybody thinks he's still going to be a bad guy. So here's that TV studio. See how I told you the fans sat in the TV studio there? So here comes Dr. X. Now it's interesting because you notice he's wearing the white mask now and not the black one. But he's got those Dick Buyer boots on. And he doesn't have his tunic top or anything on. He doesn't have his long tights on here. Well, what he's doing here is Marty O'Neill, the announcer, is introducing him as Larry Hennig's partner for this match. Because Lars Anderson, the guy with the blonde hair in the back, Larry's regular partner, has an injured arm and the doctor won't let him wrestle. So Doc agreed to be his partner. And this is also the return of Dr. X. Well, guess what? During the course of the match, Larry Hennig was using some foreign objects, and Dr. X was now telling the referee, hey, what? Look at his knee, look at his knee. And Hennig pushed him a little bit, they got into a fracas. And it's amazing, never doubt the miracle of medicine, guys, because Lars Anderson's arm was immediately healed. As if by, and there he is, he's holding Dr. X. You see, they got him bloodied up, and they're trying to break up this melee between them on TV. And now Dr. X, he wants a match against Hennig and Lars Anderson. And he says, they attacked me, they're like a couple of toads. He says, I got a name for them, Hodis and Totus, ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. And the fans would start doing this at ringside. Just control them, right? But Dr. X was now a good guy. Immediately, they turned him babyface. And his excuse when he came out, he had an explanation for this too. When he came back after this year, Marty O'Neill asked him, he says, what's the reason for the change of heart, your style of wrestling? He says, well, my son goes to school and they found out that I was wrestling under a mask and that I was doing the evil things that I was doing. And he said, my son got beat up and he defended me. And he said, I felt if he's going to defend me, I want to make him proud of me and I'm going to wrestle on the side of the right side. So,
Aw.
makes perfect sense, right? Here's a guy named the Super Destroyer. Technicolor, right? The story behind the Super Destroyer. He started out getting some early training from a guy named Vern Gagne. He wrestled here in the early 60s as Sonny Cooper. And then he left and he went down to Texas and he wrestled in the Fritz von Erich territory. Did any of you guys see the Von Erich movie that came out? Yep. Fritz von Erich was the Vern Gagne of the Texas circuit down there. And he was the one that gave Sonny Cooper, whose real name was Don Jardine. He gave Don Jardine a mask and said, here, I want to use you as the spoiler. Nobody's going to know who you are. Well, he did the spoiler thing, and it was really weird because, again, you know how fans either don't know or can't figure it out. He's the spoiler in Texas, and he's got this gimmick where I'm not taking the mask off because I don't want anybody to know who I am. And they did have rumors down there that he was deformed, and that's the way he wore the mask. But so the spoiler did really well. Well, he was going to go up to New York in 1972, Madison Square Garden area, which was the old WWF territory at the time. And New York Athletic Commission, they had the weirdest law that no wrestler could work in Madison Square Garden under a mask. And that was legit. We will not allow a wrestler to be masked. So Don Jardine goes in there, billed as the spoiler, with his face showing. There's the spoiler. But he'd take his mask off up in New York, and everywhere else he went, he was, the spoiler with a mask. Now, I tell you that story because it's going to come in handy as we get down. So the Super Destroyer was while he's wrestling as the spoiler, he's also going down to the Carolinas on the Mid-Atlantic as the Super Destroyer. You think there's two different guys. They look different. Look at the outfits. Look at the mask. Two different guys, right? Yeah, totally. You got me, fool. Okay. So he was the spoiler and did well with it. There's Don Jardine, younger picture of him without his mask on. I don't know, maybe he did look better with the mask on. But anyway, Don Jardine, great story. Now, it gets better with Don. Okay, we're going to wait and go to that next one in a second. So Don Jardine comes in as the Super Destroyer to work for Vern Gagne in 1977. And of course, nobody knows where he comes from. The same old story, don't know what he weighs. He's the Super Destroyer. Well, he was here about close to a year, and Vern decided that he really wasn't going over the way he wanted him to. He'd get in the top matches, but the fans weren't reacting to him. He did not have the reaction with this audience that he had in Texas. And he didn't have the reaction that some of our other mask guys got from the fans. So Vern literally told him, he says, you know what, we're gonna, in Denver, we are going to have you unmasked after this card. You're gonna unmask for the Crusher. Jardine says, the hell I am. He says, this is how I make my money. I'm not gonna do it. He tried to pull a Dick Buyer here. No, you're gonna unmask. No, I'm not. So Don Jardine left the building. And the Crusher got credit for unmasking him, and they announced it. The Super Destroyer refused to wrestle the Crusher, and he's suspended. He's gone, done. Retired. Okay? So, that was one time when it didn't work. Now we got these two guys. So Don Jardine as Super Destroyer is gone, and Vern, he's already got contracts all over the AWA with the Super Destroyer appearing. But now there's no Super Destroyer. So he pulled out the guy, the one on the right, or your left, I don't know, I can't. The one in the middle burned his driver's license, right, Joanne?
Sure.
There you go. Remember the one on the right and the one on the left? You know the song. Anyway, Vern had to get a quick Super Destroyer, so he comes up, he contacts a guy named Bob Remus, who he had trained for the business like 4 years earlier. And Bob Remus had worked around the different territories as Bob Remus, as Bob Slaughter, DI Bob Slaughter. And Vern calls him up and says, Bob, I need you. You got to put a mask on and come up here. And you're going to become Super Destroyer, but you got to be better than the Super Destroyer that just left, so you're going to be Mark II. You know, bigger and better. But you can't just have a Mark II because then he needs a partner, so he comes up with Mark III. You got a big herd of Lincolns here or something. So anyway, we had Mark II and Mark III, and they had a manager named Lord Alfred Hayes. His lordship. And Bob Remus, and the other guy was named Neil Gway. Now that's a nice name in this corner at 280 pounds, Neil Gway. That's going to get you off your seat. So he's better off wrestling as the Super Destroyer. He also wrestled as the Hangman, and he wrestled as Big John Louis. That sounds better than Neil Gway. But anyway, they had quite a successful team here for about 2 years. And eventually, weirdly enough, Mark III got unmasked right in St. Paul. They unmasked him, never revealed his name, and he never wrestled here again. We never got an answer to the question. Hello? And Super Destroyer Mark II, you know, because he was bigger and better, he was built not just from Singapore like Don Jardine was, he was built from Gibraltar. Gibraltar. So eventually they were unmasked. Neil Gway went out to New York and wrestled as the Hangman. He had a rope and a noose that he would choke wrestlers with. I don't know if that was legal or not. There's D.I. Bob Slaughter, Bob Remus, and he later became Sergeant Slaughter, kids. He ended up being a representative with the G.I. Joe doll, action figure. Became America's hero, Sergeant Slaughter, later on. But nobody figured out at the time that that was this Super Destroyer Mark II. You know, he's got a chin that stood out like the grill on a Packard in the 50s, doesn't he? But anyway, that was Bob Slaughter. And there's the Hangman, Neil Gway. I told you about the rope. He also wrestled as the Hangman in New York with that noose. And here's a unique guy. The Four Faces of Edie. Guy named Bill Edie. I want you to look up at the upper left. It says Bolo Mongol. Bill Edie was a guy that came into the business, and a guy named Gito Mongol. They were from Mongolia, I guess. And Gito needed a partner, so he got this young guy, shaved his head, and had a little spout on the top, and called him Bolo Mongol. Allegedly, they were brothers. And that's his first identity. Well, then a few years later, you can see Bolo standing there with the title belt on the end. He was a big dude. Short time later, he decided to do the mask gimmick, and he became the masked superstar. That's an interesting name, but he was a heel, and actually one of the very best of the mask guys. On the microphone, very convincing, could always sell really well, get you to hate him, and he drew really well. So that was his other identity. Now this is moving into that WWF territory just a little bit, but he also wrestled as the Super Machine for the WWF. And then later on, he put face paint on and became Axe of Demolition, which was a tag team. Demolition was Axe and Smash. They were kind of Road Warrior rip-offs with their face paint. But that is Bill Eadie's career. And in any guys that he had, he was right at the top of the card. And Vern Gagne used him as that superstar for a while. The end. Not really. I did want to point out that in the AWA, if you ever heard of the Destruction Crew, Wayne Bloom and Mike Enos, they were one of the very last tag team champions for the AWA. They also wrestled under masks in a different territory, and they also went out east and wrestled as brothers Blake and Bo Beverly, blondes, strutting, colorful outfits. Scott and Bill Irwin. Scott Irwin was a wrestler who Vern Gagne trained. Bill Irwin was trained by Eddie Shaw. They were real brothers. They wrestled here as the Long Riders without masks. And they wrestled down in Fritz Von Erich's territory as, strangely enough, Super Destroyers. That was another setup. Don Jardine, the Spoiler. He was also teamed with Bobby Duncombe and Buddy Wolf, and they were spoiler number 2 when he was teamed up. So I'm looking at the clock, and it's a little after quarter after. And what I'd like to do is, I have rattled on for almost 2 hours. Lorraine says, thank God. But does anybody have a question on anything that I've asked? Jim?
What in the 60s, what would be a ballpark that one of your people that you talked about tonight, what kind of money would they make on an average year?
When you're talking about as a top flight wrestler in the 60s?
Yeah. Ballpark it.
Well, in the early 60s, Vern Gagne, actually at the end of the 50s, Vern Gagne was the first wrestler to make $100,000 a year, which put that into today's dollars. That was
pretty serious.
That was pretty serious. But the average wrestlers in the 60s, the guys like Doug Gilbert and some of the guys that we talked about, they were in the 60 to 70,000 range, which again for 1960, 65, that was great money. Okay. Nick Bockwinkel, when he was the heavyweight champion in 1975 to 1980, he was making $250,000 a year as the champion, and he worked about 6 months out of the year. It all worked out. I mean, he didn't have success, 6 months off, but he'd have 3 nights of wrestling and then a couple of nights off. And by the end of the year, he only worked 6 months. And he's making about $250 as the champion. So in the 70s, a lot of the guys were making, well over $100,000. Good money. So, anybody else? Yes, sir.
Were all these matches set up?
What are you implying? let me tell you this. Let me tell you this. Yes, the answer to your question is yes. All the matches were set up. If you followed some of the things that I said, how they did work to get matches to come across, like the Dr. X story, where 3 weeks in the studio, and he's going to get a chance. They had to get him noticed. They had to make it a reason for Vern to wrestle this newcomer, who definitely had the ability. You had to believe that maybe he could beat the champion. It's all about the believability. And one of the things about pro wrestling is, a couple of you have been here for previous talks, but pro wrestling was 100% a work. They knew before they went into the ring who was going to win and who was going to lose tonight. What they didn't know, and most of the time they would know the finish, By the finish, that means like if Vern was gonna win with the sleeper hold, or whatever it was gonna be. Or the referee was gonna get knocked down and he wasn't gonna see the bad guy do something, you know. But the matches were 100% worked. But here's what wasn't. A lot of people always thought, well, they sat down in the dressing room, you know, and they had their paper out there and it's okay. So Steve, you know, I'm gonna throw you into the ropes and then you're gonna put up your knee and I'm gonna run into it and then after that I'm gonna flip off the rope. A lot of people thought they did that kind of stuff. No, they called the match as they worked in the ring. All they had to know was what the finish was and how long they had to get there. You know, if they were gonna work a 20 or a 30-minute or a 45-minute match, they just knew at what point they had to do it. And the referee was always in on what was the finish. So the referee knew if he had to be part of the finish. When I say that, I mean like he had to get knocked down at this specific time, or he had to be turned around and missing the tag and they're beating up on the guy behind him. You know, the referee had to know his part in it too. And it's always funny because a lot of people didn't realize how important that referee was, because people would get so frustrated with him. You know, they'd call him blind, they'd call him worthless, how can you referee, you don't see anything, you know, and you could have counted 20 and you're, but the truth of the matter was the referee was the genius of the whole thing, because he had to do what he had to do to make it work. So it was a work, and the matches were finished. Now the reason they did it, and then you could ask your next question, it was all a soap opera. So tonight we wrestle, and Steve and we wrestle, and he's the bad guy, and he gets disqualified. Well, he got disqualified because he knocked me out. You know, that brass knuckles that the referee missed. So I gotta get a rematch. So now we're gonna have a rematch. Well, in the rematch, now maybe his partner interferes, and I end up losing again. Well, now the fans are still behind me. They want me to win. They want me to end this lunatic. So that's how the matches, it was all a soap opera. And one of the things that the promoters did was they would go 6 months out, and this is really stretching. They would say, this is where we want to be in April. We want to have a cage match. And when they had the cage match, that was like, they can't settle it. They're out fighting in the ring, outside the ring. They, you know, had interference, and we're going to end it once and for all. We're going to put them in the cage, and one of them's going to, you know, they always had it like one of them's not coming out. But that was the finish. So they started in October, and they wanted to go to April. And by doing that, these successful matches build up to that climax. And then that's the blow, they call it a blow-off match. Because then the two guys that were in that feud, they'd move on to another program with another wrestler. They'd have another thing already working. So now your next question.
My grandpa always used to watch Wrestling with Russ.
Wrestling with
Russ? Wrestling with Russ. It was on like Saturday night or something.
Russ?
Russ, yeah.
I don't know what that is. How old is your grandpa?
This was probably 50s.
Wrestling with Russ. And it was local?
Oh, it was on TV, I don't know.
Okay. Well, I've never heard the name. It sounds like somebody was.
Something coming out with it?
Yeah. Now I can't go to sleep again. Okay, what else?
Well, you're sort.
No, what did you read next? Go ahead.
On the way down, we were talking about the Bashans.
Yeah.
I know it's a different subject, but.
No, it's not a difference.
Was the butcher actually his brother?
There's another guy implying something. The thing about pro wrestling is, that 9 times out of 10, when they had two guys that were together and they claimed to be brothers, usually they weren't.
Okay.
Usually the two guys that looked similar, they dressed alike, or they were the same height, or whatever.
We forgot the brother's name.
Mad Dog.
No, not Mad Dog. The
Butcher.
Butcher, what, yeah. Okay.
But the answer to your question is
Maurice
yes.
was Mad Dog's first.
Yes. The answer to your question is yes. Maurice and Paul Vachon were real brothers
That's
on
what I thought.
Montreal. Okay?
Also, a few years ago, there was a feature article in Esquire magazine about Mad Dog.
Mhm.
And he mentioned his sister.
Vivian.
That
Real
she
name
was a
was-
pro wrestler.
Real name was Diane.
Okay, she wrestled as Vivian.
She wrestled as Vivian Vachon,
Okay.
And this was back in 1968, 69, 70, 71, 72 area.
Mhm.
And she kind of brought women's wrestling back into vogue.
Okay.
You know, women's wrestling, generally speaking, because there was such a small group of wrestlers, or small group of lady wrestlers,
Mhm.
they were more of a traveling attraction back in the 50s and the 60s, where a promoter would bring them into, you know, bring 2 or 4 wrestlers, lady wrestlers in, and have them on their circuit for a month, and then they would move on,
Mhm.
because there were only so many of them. When Vivian came along, there was a surge, a resurgence of lady wrestling, a lot of wrestlers that came along, and she was prominent. And she was good here because she had the reputation with her brothers.
Sure.
Mad Dog and Butcher were real brothers. They came from a family of 13. And it was interesting because not often in wrestling are they real brothers, or do real brothers get recognized as real brothers. I'll give you an example. Paul Vachon, Butcher, he wrestled in the Twin Cities in 1958 when he was just starting in the business. And he was younger than Mad Dog. Mad Dog always called him his little brother, but Butcher was like a foot higher and 100 pounds heavier. So Mad Dog was the little square with a tough one. Well, anyway, in 1958, Vern needed a Russian to team up with Ivan and Carol Kelmakov. And conveniently, he found Nikita. Oh, that drives me nuts. Nikita, I'll think of it. I thought of the shadow. Give me a break. Anyway, Nikita comes in, this big Russian. Well, nobody knew that was Paul Vachon. And he wrestled here for a few matches, and then he was gone, and he went around the country. And Paul wrestled all around the country, literally out of the United States for about a decade, where Mad Dog stayed here and in Canada. And then in '68, Vern brought them together, and they worked here for the next 3 years. And when they went to Atlanta, Butcher went down to Atlanta, and you talk about real big brothers. Mad Dog was working for Vern, and Butcher was down in Atlanta working in that territory. And a guy named Eric Pomeroy walked into the wrestling office, and the promoter, literally, you talk about how stuff happens. The promoter looked up with Eric Pomeroy, and Paul Vachon was sitting there. He looked up and he goes, "Holy shit, you look like him without hair." And he made Eric Pomeroy Stan Vachon, and they were brothers, Stan and Paul. So, not always real brothers, but most of them were fake brothers. The Crusher, one and only, he wrestled for about 4 years with his brother, Stan Lasowski. And then when Stan got tired of working with Crusher, Crusher became Crusher, because he was Reggie before that. And then he went on, and Stan found another brother. He's now Stan Nielsen with Art. So, you know, just move on to a new territory. Fans never knew the difference. Another question.
Well, your story about Killer Kowalski and Yukon Eric losing an ear when Kowalski jumped off the top rope was true, but it wasn't really complete. And here's why. Because following the match, the referee was asked by Wally Carbo if he still had Yukon Eric's ear. He said, "Well, I had to take it out of my pocket." That was kind of an eerie feeling.
Ba boom. Okay. I told him to keep his day job, but he is retired. Okay.